The afternoon was still, with only the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird to break the silence. Oliver Bray adjusted the wide-brimmed hat he always wore during his walks near the edge of the forest. Living alone in his small wooden cabin, nestled between towering pines and the expansive marshland, he had grown used to the solitude. It wasn't the kind of isolation most people could tolerate, but for Oliver, it was perfect. His life was simple: chopping wood, fishing in the nearby stream, and roaming the wild terrain that surrounded his home. But today was different. As he stepped carefully along the spongy ground bordering the swamp, he heard a sound that made him freeze mid-step. It wasn't the usual croak of a frog or the squelching of mud. This was something else entirely, a faint, guttural moan, almost like a whimper. It was low and trembling, a sound filled with desperation. Oliver's ears sharpened, his body tense as he scanned the landscape. His eyes moved from the canopy above to the swamp below, searching for the source. The sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streaks, reflecting off the murky water that stretched before him. Then he spotted it. At first, he thought it was just another patch of mud or a clump of debris. But as he narrowed his gaze, the shape became clearer. It was an animal, dark and solid against the pale gray muck. He moved closer, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth with each step, until the figure came into full view. A young bear. The creature was stuck, its legs submerged in the swamp up to its chest. It was small, likely no more than a year old, its fur matted and caked with mud. Its sides heaved with labored breaths, each one more shallow than the last. The bear's head drooped low, its round ears twitching slightly as it attempted, in vain, to lift itself from the mire. It was a heartbreaking sight. The animal's front paws scrabbled weakly at the edge of the swamp, but the slick mud offered no grip. Each feeble movement only caused it to sink deeper. Oliver's heart clenched. He knew this swamp well. It was deceptive, a quiet trap that could claim anything foolish or unfortunate enough to wander into its grasp. Animals often avoided it instinctively, but this young bear must have been lost, perhaps separated from its mother, and stumbled into the danger unwittingly. For a moment, Oliver hesitated. He was no stranger to the forest dangers, and he understood better than most the unpredictability of wild animals. Even in its weakened state, the bear was no less dangerous. One swipe of its paw could leave him seriously injured. But as he stood there, taking in the creature's trembling form and the silent plea in its dark, glassy eyes, he made his decision. He couldn't leave it. "All right, buddy," Oliver muttered, more to himself than to the bear. "Let's get you out of there." The first thing he needed was a plan. Charging into the swamp without thinking would get him stuck as well, and then they'd both be in trouble. His eyes darted around the area, taking in his surroundings. He needed something sturdy, a branch, a log, anything that could help him distribute his weight across the unstable ground. A few feet away, an old, fallen tree lay partially submerged in the marshy soil, its bark stripped bare by years of weathering. Perfect. Oliver moved quickly, his boots squelching in the mud as he reached the tree. He grabbed one end, testing its weight. It was heavy but manageable. Planting his feet firmly, he lifted the log with a grunt, dragging it toward the swamp. The bear flinched at the noise, its body jerking slightly, but it didn't have the strength to struggle further. "It's okay," Oliver said softly, his voice low and steady. He wasn't sure if the bear could understand him, but he spoke anyway, hoping his tone would calm the frightened animal. "I'm here to help." With a final heave, Oliver positioned the log so it extended out over the swamp, creating a crude bridge. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold his weight. He grabbed the length of rope he always carried in his pack, a habit born from years of outdoor living, and tied a loop at one end. The other end he secured around his waist, just in case he lost his footing. The air was thick with the earthy smell of damp moss and decaying vegetation as Oliver stepped carefully onto the log. It shifted slightly under his weight, creaking ominously, but it held. He crouched low, moving slowly to avoid startling the bear. The creature's dark eyes followed his every movement, a mix of fear and exhaustion evident in its gaze. Almost there, Oliver murmured, inching closer. The mud sucked greedily at the bear's lower body, its grip relentless. Oliver reached the end of the log and extended the looped rope toward the animal. Come on, work with me here. The bear flinched as the rope brushed against its fur, letting out a low, pitiful groan. Oliver paused, his hand steady, giving the animal a moment to adjust. He knew he had to be gentle but firm. Any sudden movements could send them both tumbling into the swamp. Slowly, carefully, he maneuvered the loop around the bear's shoulders, securing it just enough to hold without choking. Once the rope was in place, Oliver braced himself. He wrapped the loose end around his hands, planting his feet firmly on the log. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled. The resistance was immediate and immense. The mud clung to the bear like a vice, refusing to release its prey. Oliver's muscles strained as he leaned back, using his full weight to counter the swamp's pull. The rope bit into his palms, even through the thick leather of his gloves. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop. Come on, he grunted, his voice a mix of determination and desperation. The bear let out a weak growl, its front legs clawing at the log as Oliver pulled with all his strength. Slowly, agonizingly, the creature began to move. Its chest emerged first, then its front legs, coated in a thick layer of mud. Each inch felt like a victory, but the battle was far from over. Oliver adjusted his stance, digging his heels into the log for better leverage. The rope creaked under the strain, and his arms burned with the effort. The bear's back legs were still trapped, the mud clinging stubbornly to its body. Oliver gave one final, heaving pull, his teeth clenched and his muscles screaming in protest. With a wet, sucking sound, the bear broke free. It collapsed onto the log in a heap, its sides heaving as it gulped in air. Oliver fell backward, landing hard on the rough wood, his chest rising and falling in tandem with the exhausted animal. Oliver Bray stood by the edge of the swamp, hands on his knees, panting heavily. The young bear lay sprawled on the damp forest floor, caked in mud and shivering. Oliver's heart was still racing from the rescue, his muscles aching from the effort of pulling the creature free. But there was no time to rest. The bear, now free from the swamp, was far from safe. Its thin, labored breaths and trembling body told him all he needed to know. It wouldn't survive out here alone in its current state. Oliver wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead, glancing toward his cabin in the distance. He could barely make out the small wooden structure through the dense trees. His mind raced. Could he even care for a bear? Was he putting himself in danger by taking it back? But then his gaze fell on the creature's matted fur, its helpless form struggling even to lift its head. There was no choice. You're coming with me, Oliver muttered, more to himself than to the bear. He bent down, cautiously approaching the animal. The bear flinched at first, its dark eyes widening in fear. Oliver held his hands up, palms open. Easy, buddy. I'm not going to hurt you. He crouched lower, inching closer. The bear's ears twitched weakly, but it didn't have the strength to resist. Oliver gently slid his arms under its muddy, trembling body. The weight surprised him. Despite being young, the bear was heavy, its dense frame a stark reminder of its wild nature. Oliver grunted, his knees straining as he lifted it. The bear let out a soft, pitiful groan, its head lolling against his shoulder. Hang in there, Oliver murmured, adjusting his grip. His boots squelched in the mud as he began the slow, arduous trek back to his cabin. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Every step felt like a battle. The bear's muddy fur clung to his jacket, the damp weight dragging at his arms. Sweat soaked through his clothes despite the cool air. By the time he reached the cabin, his legs felt like jelly. He staggered up the porch steps, his shoulder bumping against the door frame as he pushed the door open with his foot. The interior of the cabin was warm and inviting, the faint smell of pine and wood smoke lingering in the air. Oliver kicked the door shut behind him, carefully lowering the bear onto a worn rug by the fireplace. For a moment, he just stood there catching his breath. The bear lay still, its chest rising and falling shallowly. Its fur was a matted mess of mud and debris, and Oliver could see the faintest traces of blood where branches and sharp roots had scraped its sides. He swallowed hard, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't let it die here. "All right," he said aloud, clapping his hands together as if to rally himself. "Let's get you cleaned up." He grabbed a bucket and filled it with warm water from the stove. The kettle had been boiling when he left, and the timing couldn't have been better. With a rag in hand, Oliver knelt beside the bear. It shifted slightly, a low whimper escaping its throat. "Sure, it's okay," Oliver said, his voice low and soothing. He dipped the rag into the water and wrung it out before gently pressing it to the bear's side. The mud clung stubbornly, and it took several careful swipes to reveal the patch of fur beneath. The bear flinched, a soft growl rumbling in its chest, but it didn't lash out. Oliver worked methodically, cleaning away the layers of muck that had nearly claimed the creature's life. The process was slow and grueling. The bear's fur seemed to hold onto every speck of mud, and Oliver's arms ached from the repetitive motion. By the time he finished, the bucket water was dark and murky, and his own clothes were streaked with grime. But the bear looked better, cleaner, though still fragile. Next came warmth. Oliver tossed a few logs into the fireplace, stoking the embers until flames roared to life. The golden glow filled the cabin, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He grabbed an old blanket from a nearby chair, draping it over the bear's body. It was the same blanket he'd used during harsh winters, and now it would serve to keep his unexpected guest alive. "Now food," Oliver muttered, running a hand through his messy hair. He rummaged through his pantry, pulling out what little he thought might work. He settled on a mix of oats, honey, and some leftover fish he'd caught the day before. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Oliver placed the makeshift meal in front of the bear, stepping back to give it space. For a long moment, the bear didn't move. Then, slowly, it lifted its head, sniffing tentatively at the offering. Its movements were clumsy, and it took several tries before it managed to lap at the food. Oliver watched in silence, relief washing over him as the bear began to eat. "Good boy," he said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're going to be okay." As the hours passed, the bear grew more responsive. It shifted beneath the blanket, its dark eyes flicking toward Oliver with something that resembled curiosity, or maybe trust. Oliver found himself talking to it, his words filling the quiet cabin. "I can't keep calling you bear, can I?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "How about Bruno?" "Yeah, you look like a Bruno." The bear didn't react, but Oliver took its silence as approval. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Bruno it is." Caring for the bear became a routine over the next few days. Each morning, Oliver would clean its wounds, feed it, and talk to it as if it could understand him. Bruno, in turn, began to regain strength. It started with small movements, shifting its weight, lifting its head, until one day it managed to stand on unsteady legs. Oliver watched in awe as Bruno took a few wobbly steps, its claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. "There you go, buddy," Oliver said, his voice filled with pride. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when doubt and fear crept in. What if Bruno never recovered fully? What if the bear turned on him once it regained its strength? Oliver wrestled with these thoughts late at night, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. Still, he refused to give up. Each day brought small victories, a longer stride, a louder growl, a flicker of life returning to Bruno's eyes. The bond between man and bear grew stronger, built on trust and shared struggle. By the end of the week, Bruno was moving more confidently, following Oliver around the cabin with an almost puppy-like curiosity. The once terrified creature now seemed at ease, its eyes bright and alert. Oliver couldn't help but smile as he watched Bruno sniff at the firewood pile, its snout twitching with interest. "You've got a second chance," Oliver said quietly, scratching the back of his neck. "And I guess so do I." For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel so empty. The soft glow of the morning sun seeped through the cabin's weathered shutters, casting streaks of light onto the wooden floor. Oliver Bray sat in his old, creaking chair near the fireplace, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. His eyes were fixed on Bruno, the young bear who had become an unexpected part of his life. Bruno was sprawled across the rug in front of the fire, his massive body taking up most of the space, his fur shimmering in the soft amber glow. Oliver had grown used to the sight over the past few weeks, but this morning something felt different. He watched as the bear shifted in his sleep, letting out a soft, rumbling huff. The rhythmic rise and fall of Bruno's chest was a soothing reminder of how far they had come since that day in the swamp. The weak, trembling creature he had pulled from the mire had transformed into a robust and curious young bear, full of life and energy. But as Oliver sipped his coffee, a knot of unease twisted in his chest. Something had been gnawing at him, a thought he had been trying to push aside. Bruno wasn't a dog or a cat or any other kind of domestic animal. He wasn't a pet. He was a bear, a wild animal, born to roam the forests, to hunt, to live by his instincts. No matter how much they had bonded, no matter how deeply Oliver cared for him, there was no denying the truth. Bruno didn't belong here. The realization had been creeping in slowly, like the tide inching closer to shore. At first, Oliver had been too caught up in the act of saving Bruno to think about what came next. The bear had needed him, needed warmth, food, care, and Oliver had stepped into that role without hesitation. But as the days turned into weeks, as Bruno grew stronger and more independent, the lines between caretaker and captor began to blur. The first signs were subtle. Bruno's behavior changed as he regained his strength. What had once been timid curiosity became bold exploration. The bear started testing his surroundings, pawing at the furniture, nudging open doors with his snout, and even trying to climb onto the countertops. At first, Oliver found it endearing, even amusing, but then came the more alarming moments. One evening, as Oliver was chopping vegetables for dinner, he turned to find Bruno standing on his hind legs, his massive paws resting on the edge of the kitchen table. The bear's eyes were fixed on the cutting board, where a freshly filleted fish lay. Before Oliver could react, Bruno swiped at the table, sending the fish flying onto the floor. The sound of claws scraping against wood made Oliver's stomach tighten. "Bruno!" he shouted, his voice sharper than he intended. The bear dropped back onto all fours with a heavy thud, looking at Oliver with what could almost be described as defiance. For a moment, they stared at each other, the air between them thick with tension. Then Bruno huffed and lumbered away, leaving Oliver to clean up the mess. Incidents like that became more frequent. Bruno's instincts were surfacing, raw and unfiltered. He wasn't being malicious. Oliver knew that. But he was behaving like what he was, a bear, a creature of the wild, driven by primal needs and impulses. The cabin, with its wooden walls and human rules, was starting to feel like a cage. And Oliver knew that no cage, no matter how comfortable, could contain something as wild and untamed as Bruno. The breaking point came on a clear, crisp morning. Oliver had taken Bruno outside to stretch his legs. The bear was playful, batting at the tall grass with his paws and rolling onto his back in the sunlight. Oliver watched with a smile, leaning against a tree as he sipped his coffee. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine that this life could continue, that he and Bruno could coexist, that they could carve out a little corner of the world where man and beast live side by side. But then Bruno froze. His head snapped up, his ears swiveling like satellite dishes. Oliver followed the bear's gaze and saw it. A rabbit, small and sleek, nibbling on a patch of clover near the tree line. In an instant, Bruno's entire demeanor changed. His playful energy vanished, replaced by something predatory and electric. "Bruno," Oliver said softly, setting down his mug. The bear didn't respond. His muscles coiled, his body low to the ground, every fiber of his being focused on the unsuspecting rabbit. Before Oliver could stop him, Bruno lunged. The rabbit bolted, darting into the underbrush with Bruno hot on its heels. The ground shook beneath the bear's powerful strides, and the forest erupted into chaos, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the sharp cry of the rabbit fading into the distance. Oliver stood frozen, his heart pounding. When Bruno returned an hour later, there was blood on his muzzle. He looked at Oliver with dark, inscrutable eyes, his chest heaving from the exertion of the hunt. Oliver stared back, his throat tight. There was no mistaking what had happened, no denying what Bruno was. He was a predator, a creature of instinct and survival. And as much as Oliver cared for him, as much as he had grown to love the bear's presence in his life, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. That night, Oliver sat by the fire, his thoughts heavy. Bruno lay on the rug, cleaning his fur with slow, deliberate movements. The sight was so familiar, so normal, and yet it felt like a goodbye. Oliver ran a hand through his hair, his eyes stinging with unspoken emotion. "You're not meant to be here, buddy," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Bruno didn't react, his attention focused on his grooming. But Oliver's words hung in the air, a painful acknowledgement of the inevitable. Over the next few days, Oliver found himself watching Bruno more closely, searching for signs that he had made the right decision. He saw it in the way Bruno sniffed the air when the wind carried the scent of the forest through the open windows. He saw it in the restless pacing, the way Bruno's claws clicked against the floor as he moved from room to room, as though searching for something that wasn't there. The cabin, which had once been a sanctuary, was becoming a prison, and Oliver couldn't bear to see Bruno confined. He couldn't bear to keep him from the life he was meant to live. The bond they had formed was undeniable. In the quiet moments, when Bruno rested his head on Oliver's lap or followed him around the cabin like a loyal companion, it was easy to forget what they were, man and bear, worlds apart. But the wildness in Bruno's eyes was a constant reminder. He didn't belong in a cabin. He belonged in the forest, under the open sky, where he could run and hunt and be free. Oliver knew what he had to do, but knowing didn't make it any easier. The air was cool and damp as the morning mist clung to the trees surrounding Oliver Bray's cabin. He stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden railing, his eyes scanning the forest in the distance. Bruno sat at his feet, massive and imposing, yet somehow still carrying an aura of innocence. The young bear had come a long way from the fragile, mud-covered creature Oliver had pulled from the swamp weeks ago. His coat now gleamed with health, his muscles taut and strong. But that transformation, as remarkable as it was, only made the decision that weighed on Oliver's mind all the more agonizing. He had to let Bruno go. The thought churned in his gut, leaving him restless and unsettled. Bruno had become more than just a temporary charge. He was a companion, a silent presence that filled the lonely corners of Oliver's life. And yet, every day, Bruno's wild nature became more apparent. It was in the way his ears twitched at the faintest rustle in the trees, the way his powerful legs carried him with ease and grace, the way his instincts surged to the surface when he caught the scent of prey. Bruno didn't belong here, confined by walls and boundaries. He belonged to the wild. Oliver glanced down at the bear, who was busy pawing at an old boot he had dragged out from under the porch. The sight brought a faint smile to Oliver's face, but the smile quickly faded. Every instinct in him wanted to keep Bruno close, to keep this strange, unexpected bond alive. But he knew better. To keep Bruno here, in this small, human world, would be to deny the bear his true nature. It would be selfish. Still, the thought of letting Bruno go felt like a betrayal. Oliver had spent weeks caring for him, watching over him, and nursing him back to health. He had poured his heart into ensuring Bruno's survival, and in return, the bear had given him something he hadn't even realized he was missing: companionship, purpose, and a sense of connection. To let Bruno go now felt like severing a part of himself. But the signs were clear. Bruno's restlessness had grown more pronounced in recent days. He paced around the cabin, nosing at the doors and windows, his movements sharp and agitated. When they ventured outside, Bruno's attention was always drawn to the forest, his dark eyes scanning the trees as though searching for something. And then there was the deer incident, an undeniable reminder that Bruno's instincts could not be tamed. Oliver had delayed the decision as long as he could, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But deep down, he had always known this day would come. He had spent the past night preparing. The decision to let Bruno go wasn't just about opening the cabin door and sending him off. If Bruno was to survive, Oliver needed to ensure he was returned to a part of the forest where he would thrive, a place deep enough, wild enough, and far enough from human interference. He had carefully packed a bag with supplies for the journey, a few tools, some smoked fish, and a heavy blanket, just in case the nights turned cold. Not that Bruno needed it, but old habits died hard. By dawn, Oliver was ready, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He crouched down beside Bruno, running a hand through the bear's thick fur. Bruno paused as chewing on the boot, turning his head to look at Oliver. His deep, intelligent eyes were calm, unknowing. "You don't even realize what's coming, do you?" Oliver murmured, his voice low and strained. Bruno blinked slowly, his head tilting slightly to one side, as though trying to understand. For a moment, Oliver hesitated. His hand lingered on Bruno's fur, his heart battling against his mind. He could still change his mind, still keep Bruno here, still hold on to this fragile, fleeting connection. But the image of Bruno pacing restlessly, his claws scraping against the cabin floor, burned in Oliver's mind. He couldn't ignore the truth. Bruno needed the wild, and Oliver had to be the one to give it to him. "Come on, buddy," Oliver said finally, standing up. He grabbed the pack from where it rested by the door and slung it over his shoulder. Bruno rose to his feet as well, shaking his massive body before ambling over to Oliver's side. The bear let out a low rumble, a sound that was neither a growl nor a sigh, but something in between. The two of them set off into the forest. The morning air was crisp, the ground damp beneath their feet. Oliver led the way, following a path he had marked on the map the night before. Bruno trailed close behind, his heavy steps crunching through the underbrush. The forest was alive with sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant creak of branches swaying in the wind. But Oliver barely noticed. His mind was consumed with the task ahead. The journey was slow and deliberate. Oliver stopped often, scanning the landscape to ensure they were on the right path. Bruno, for his part, seemed unfazed. The bear sniffed at tree trunks, pawed at fallen logs, and occasionally glanced back at Oliver, as if checking to make sure he was still there. Each time their eyes met, Oliver felt a pang of guilt. Bruno trusted him completely, and here he was, leading the bear toward a future that Bruno couldn't possibly understand. As the hours passed, the forest grew denser, the trees taller and more tightly packed. The light filtered through the canopy in scattered beams, casting dappled patterns on the ground. It was beautiful, untouched, and wild. Oliver's steps slowed as they reached the heart of the forest, a place he had scouted long ago during one of his many solitary hikes. This was it. This was where Bruno belonged. Oliver stopped, his chest tight with emotion. Bruno stopped too, standing at his side and sniffing the air. The bear's ears twitched, his nose quivering as he took in the unfamiliar sense of the deep forest. Oliver crouched down, setting the pack on the ground. He opened it and pulled out the smoked fish, placing it on a flat rock nearby. Bruno sniffed at the offering, but didn't eat. Instead, he turned his attention to Oliver, his dark eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made Oliver's throat tighten. "This is where we part ways, buddy," Oliver said quietly, his voice thick. He reached out, resting a hand on Bruno's head. The bear didn't move, didn't flinch. Oliver swallowed hard, his fingers brushing through Bruno's fur one last time. "You're going to be okay out here. This is where you're meant to be." The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them. Oliver stood slowly, his legs feeling like lead. Bruno remained where he was, watching him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Oliver thought the bear might follow him, that he might have to force himself to walk away. But then Bruno turned, his massive frame moving toward the trees. He didn't look back. Oliver stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where Bruno had disappeared. The forest was quiet now, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a sense of loss so profound it left him breathless. But beneath the pain was a flicker of peace. He had done the right thing. With heavy steps, Oliver turned, and began the long walk back to the cabin. The forest felt different now, emptier, quieter. But as he reached the edge of the clearing and saw his cabin in the distance, he allowed himself a small, bittersweet smile. Bruno was where he belonged, and maybe, in time, Oliver would find his own place too. The forest clearing was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, painting patches of gold on the soft, mossy ground. Oliver Bray stood still, his heart heavy as he watched Bruno, the bear he had saved, cared for, and grown to love, hesitantly step toward the edge of the trees. The towering pines loomed ahead, their shadows deep and endless, and each of Bruno's tentative movements felt like a thread unraveling between them. Oliver's breath hitched in his chest as he tightened his grip on the pack slung over his shoulder. He had chosen this spot carefully, a clearing deep in the forest where Bruno would have the space and safety to begin his life anew. But now that the moment was here, he found himself frozen, caught between pride and grief. Every step Bruno took away from him was a reminder of the bond they had shared, a bond that was now being tested in the harshest way possible. "Go on, buddy," Oliver murmured under his breath, his voice trembling. He could barely hear his own words over the pounding of his heart. Bruno's broad shoulders rose and fell with each breath, his powerful frame now silhouetted against the dappled sunlight. The bear paused, turning his head slightly as though sensing Oliver's gaze. Their eyes met, Oliver's filled with unspoken sorrow, Bruno's unreadable but deep. For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the world narrowing to just the two of them. And then, with a small huff, Bruno turned back toward the trees, taking another slow, deliberate step forward. Oliver's chest ached. He wanted to call out, to take back everything, to lead Bruno back to the cabin where the fire was warm and the world was simpler. But he couldn't. This wasn't about him. It was about Bruno, about giving the bear the life he was meant to have, no matter how much it hurt to let him go. The days leading up to this moment had been agonizing. Every time Oliver had looked at Bruno, whether the bear was sprawled lazily by the fire or nudging him for scraps of fish at the kitchen counter, the thought of goodbye had loomed in the back of his mind like a storm cloud. He had tried to steel himself, to prepare for this moment, but nothing could have dulled the sharp edge of loss cutting through him now. Bruno took another step, his massive paws sinking into the soft earth. Oliver's throat tightened as he watched the bear's movements, so purposeful yet hesitant. It was as if Bruno, too, understood the gravity of this moment. The wild called to him, but something was holding him back. Oliver's hand instinctively twitched toward his side, wanting to reach out, to hold on to Bruno for just a little longer. "You're strong now," Oliver said aloud, his voice breaking. "You're ready for this." Bruno stopped again, this time at the very edge of the clearing. His nose lifted to the air, sniffing the scents carried by the wind. His ears twitched, his body tense but steady. Oliver wondered what Bruno was thinking, what instincts were guiding him now. Was he scared? Was he ready? Or was he simply following the pull of the forest, the place where he truly belonged? And then, just as Oliver thought Bruno might disappear entirely, the bear turned back. The motion was slow, deliberate, almost reluctant. Bruno's dark eyes met Oliver's again, and in that moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement, a flicker of understanding that no words could capture. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. Bruno didn't growl or huff or make any sound at all. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, as if to say goodbye in his own way. Oliver felt his knees weaken, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a mountain. Tears stung his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest motion might break whatever fragile connection still held them together. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Thank you," he said, his words trembling in the still air. "For trusting me. For letting me help you." Bruno's head tilted slightly, his ears flicking as though he had heard and understood. Oliver's chest tightened further, the tears now spilling freely down his face. He felt both pride and anguish, knowing that he had done the right thing, but wishing it didn't have to hurt so much. Then, Without another sound, Bruno turned back to the forest. His movements were smoother now, more confident, as he stepped fully into the shadows of the trees. The sunlight caught on his fur one last time before he disappeared completely, swallowed by the endless green. Oliver stood there long after Bruno was gone, his feet rooted to the ground as though moving would shatter him entirely. The clearing felt emptier than he ever could have imagined, the silence deafening in the absence of the bear's presence. His hands hung limply at his sides, his shoulders slumped, the grief pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. But beneath the pain, there was a flicker of something else, a quiet, bittersweet sense of peace. Bruno was where he belonged now. The forest would challenge him, yes, but it would also give him the freedom to be who he was meant to be. And Oliver, as much as it hurt, could take solace in knowing that he had given Bruno that chance. The walk back to the cabin was slow and somber. Every step felt heavier than the last, the distance stretching endlessly before him. By the time he reached the porch, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting the forest in hues of gold and amber. Oliver paused, his hand resting on the weathered railing, his gaze fixed on the trees. For the first time in weeks, the cabin felt impossibly quiet. The warmth of the fire inside, the smell of pine and smoke, the creak of the floorboards, all of it felt hollow without Bruno's presence. But Oliver didn't regret his decision. It hurt, yes. It hurt more than anything he had experienced in years. But it was right. He stepped inside, the door creaking softly as it swung shut behind him. The pack he had carried for Bruno sat, untouched by the door, a reminder of the journey they had shared. Oliver stood in the center of the room, his hands hanging at his sides, his mind replaying every moment of their time together. The swamp, the recovery, the moments of trust that had brought them here. All of it felt distant now, like a story from another lifetime. And yet, even in the quiet, Oliver found a strange comfort. Bruno was out there, somewhere living the life he was meant to live. And though their paths had diverged, Oliver knew he would carry the memory of Bruno with him always. The cabin felt empty, but Oliver's heart was full. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over the forest after the sun has dipped below the horizon. The sky above Oliver Bray's cabin was a deep indigo, studded with stars that blinked faintly through the canopy of trees. Oliver sat in his usual spot on the porch, a mug of tea cradled in his hands, its warmth a small comfort against the crisp evening air. The forest felt alive in its own way, filled with the faint sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their mysterious lives. But for Oliver, the cabin felt emptier than ever. Weeks had passed since Bruno had stepped into the forest for the last time, and though Oliver had done his best to move on, the ache of that moment lingered. He couldn't help but wonder how the young bear was faring. Had he found his place in the wild? Was he safe, strong, thriving? The questions circled endlessly in Oliver's mind, unanswered but persistent. He took a slow sip of tea, letting the steam curl around his face, when something broke the stillness. A rustling sound, faint at first, but growing louder, came from the edge of the clearing. Oliver froze, his hand tightening around the mug. The sound wasn't like the usual shuffle of squirrels or the flutter of birds. It was heavier, deliberate. His heart quickened, a mixture of caution and curiosity pulling him to his feet. Setting the mug down on the railing, Oliver stepped off the porch, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a pale silver glow, enough to cast long shadows, but not enough to fully illuminate what lay beyond. The rustling continued, accompanied by the crack of a twig under something heavy. Oliver's breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. And then he saw it. Emerging slowly from the tree lean was a bear. Its massive form moved with a quiet grace, the moonlight catching on its fur and making it shimmer like polished stone. Oliver's chest tightened as he recognized the familiar gait, the way the bear's head tilted slightly as though curious about its surroundings. It was Bruno. For a moment, Oliver thought he might be imagining it, that his mind was playing tricks on him in the quiet loneliness of the night. But as the bear stepped fully into the clearing, their eyes met, and all doubt vanished. It was him, It was Bruno. Oliver stood rooted to the spot, a strange mix of joy and disbelief washing over him. Bruno had grown in the weeks since they had parted. His frame was broader, his muscles more defined, and his coat gleamed with health. But it wasn't just his physical presence that struck Oliver. It was the way Bruno looked at him, calm and steady, as though no time had passed at all. "Bruno?" Oliver said softly, his voice barely audible. He didn't dare move closer, afraid that any sudden motion might scare the bear away. Bruno's ears twitched at the sound of his name, but he remained still, his dark eyes locked onto Oliver's. The connection was immediate, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared. For what felt like an eternity, neither man nor bear moved. The world around them seemed to fade, the sounds of the forest dimming until there was only the quiet understanding between them. Bruno shifted slightly, his powerful shoulders rolling as he took a step closer to the cabin. Oliver's pulse quickened, but he stayed where he was, letting Bruno make the choice. The bear stopped a few paces from the porch, his massive paws pressing into the soft earth. His gaze swept over the cabin, the clearing, and finally returned to Oliver. There was no fear in Bruno's eyes, no hesitation, only a calm confidence, as though he had come back not out of need but out of choice. Oliver felt his throat tighten. "You came back," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. He didn't know what else to say, didn't even know if words mattered. Bruno wouldn't stay. Oliver knew that. This wasn't a reunion meant to rekindle their old bond. It was something else, something deeper. Bruno was here to remind him that what they had shared wasn't forgotten, that their connection wasn't bound by time or distance. Bruno sat down, his massive frame settling into the ground with an ease that belied his size. He huffed softly, a sound that sent a ripple of warmth through Oliver's chest. The bear tilted his head slightly, watching Oliver with an expression that could almost be called thoughtful. Oliver couldn't help but smile, a quiet, bittersweet smile that spoke of gratitude and loss all at once. "Thank you," Oliver said, his voice steady this time. He wasn't sure what he was thanking Bruno for coming back, for the time they had shared, for the lessons Oliver had learned in letting go. Maybe all of it. The minutes stretched on, the silence between them filled with a quiet understanding. Oliver didn't move, didn't try to close the distance between them. He knew better. Bruno's place was in the wild, and any attempt to hold on to him now would be selfish. This moment was enough. Finally, Bruno rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. He took one last, long look at Oliver, his dark eyes seeming to say everything words never could. Then, without a sound, he turned and began to walk back toward the forest. His massive frame melted into the shadows, his steps silent as he disappeared among the trees. Oliver stood on the porch long after Bruno was gone, his chest tight with emotion. The forest seemed to hum with life again, the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filling the air. But for Oliver, the night felt different, as though the world had shifted slightly, leaving him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. He picked up his mug, now cold, and sat back down in his chair. The ache of Bruno's absence was still there, but it was softer now, tempered by the knowledge that their bond hadn't been broken. Bruno was out there, living the life he was meant to live, but he hadn't forgotten, and neither would Oliver. As the stars above shimmered brighter, Oliver leaned back, a quiet smile on his face. The cabin felt less empty now, the memories of Bruno filling the spaces where silence once lingered. It wasn't the life Oliver had expected, but it was one he wouldn't trade for anything. Some bonds, he realized, were too strong to fade. Even in the wild,